Welcome to a special US election night edition of Sputnik, coming to you from our Westminster studio with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
And our special guest, our American political expert, Professor Inderjeet Parmar. Before I turn to him, let me just point out that the British Parliament behind me appears to be somewhat in darkness, at least dark-edged. And that might be because the political class everywhere in the world is about to enter a period of mourning. Because although we don't know the final result of the US presidential epic contest, what we do know is that it's been the most dramatic political fight of the century. And I don't exclude George W. Bush's dramatic win in the year 2000. Great divisions, great cleavages have been revealed in American society, and it may be difficult for the US to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. But enough for me, a gifted amateur. Let's hear from the professional, Professor Inderjeet. We don't know the final result, but we know enough, don't we, to know that the political class, just like in the Brexit referendum contest, has been confounded.
It does look that way up to now, certainly from some of the results that we've seen. And it does seem to be echoing what happened in the Brexit vote, which was suggested to be a very close win for Remain, but ended up being a tight win for Leave. It does suggest really that polling methods are not reaching everybody who is actually playing a decisive role in these kinds of elections. And there are people out there who are probably previously politically inactive or not voting before, but who seem to be inspired to vote by the kind of candidacies or the campaigns run by people from outside of the spectrum who are not actually accepting the status quo quite in the way that people were believing that they would.
Well, 15% of them were new voters, yeah?
Right.
Was that a surprising number for you?
Well, it's not a surprising number, but what is surprising is that they don't appear in the polls.
Yeah.
So that it's clear that the polling organizations themselves need to do something in order to reach a wider cross-section of the population. But in the end, we're all reliant on the most sort of scientific methods of polling which have been available. And people like Nate Silver and 538, his website, run by mathematicians and statisticians of some stature, appear to have been getting it wrong.
Well, let me advance one reason why, and it's a factor in this election. The 15% of new voters and the tremendous turnout in places like Michigan, which wasn't even in play a few days ago, and which Trump might well have won, if not won, then come very close to winning. This is the poor, the working class, in the meanest streets, where pollsters, quite frankly, don't go. And that reveals another of the issues I'd like you to comment on. There's a bubble. It's a Westminster bubble. It's a Beltway bubble in the United States in which experts talk to each other. When I predicted on Twitter that Donald Trump was going to win, there was a deluge from liberals and people from the chattering class, working in television, working in media and so on. These people talk to themselves. They have no idea what's going down on the streets, either of Rochdale and Rotherham or of Michigan and Ohio.
I think you're right. I think the fact is that we all live in certain kinds of bubbles. We do talk to each other. We are kind of much more inward looking. And I think to some extent that is to do with professional groups. They tend to stick together in various ways and thereby talk each other into a reality which may have very little relationship with what is going on outside. But I think it's also because various studies done among those communities have suggested that there are certain communities which are out of play. If you look at Labour Party, for example, from the 1980s onwards, effectively went with the sort of sociological studies which suggested that the industrial organised working class was no longer a coherent grouping which had a kind of political saliency at all. And therefore the strategy had to shift to new blocks of voters who were much more aspirational. They wanted to enter the middle classes, and therefore they were going to vote differently, and therefore Labour had to drop various elements of its core programmes, nationalisation, clause 4 and the like. And I think that is actually what has happened, that those people have been effectively written out of politics and history almost, and I think they are now making a comeback. They are basically saying that they are not going to be ignored anymore, and they're taking the opportunities being provided by unorthodox candidates in this case. And I would say this is being provided to some extent from left and right. In the American election, Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, left and right, differences collapsing. And now, since Sanders' defeat in the Democratic nomination in the primaries, quite a number of his supporters went straight over to Donald Trump, arguing that it was against the establishment that they're backing Bernie Sanders.
So they weren't afraid of his policies and his fear-mongering?
I think there is such a deep alienation from the political establishment, from the way in which the great thing that people saw about Bernie Sanders and about Donald Trump, but they were far less immersed in the political class in general. And they were talking a language which was straight, and it was all about inequality. The fact that there's a whole system of politics and economy and so on, which was rigged against ordinary people in various ways. And the early part of Donald Trump's campaign, there was quite a lot said about Wall Street and so on, and Wall Street returned the compliment to him by giving him very little money indeed. But there is on left and right, and I think herein lies a deep crisis, and the crisis was represented effectively by Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton, if you like, was the sort of the person with a finger in the dike, trying to stop.
She's the personification of the political class.
Correct.
And as you and I have discussed before, it's no accident that Wall Street paid overwhelmingly for her campaign and gave virtually nothing to Trump. And Hillary Clinton is now paying big time for her subservience to Wall Street and its antithesis, her carelessness about Main Street, because you can't care about Wall Street and Main Street. Her support for NAFTA. There was no senator more assiduous in promoting the North American free trade area, which has devastated the industrial areas of the US, with production being moved out of the US, mainly to Mexico. So that, as we just heard, you used to be able to build cars in Michigan, but you couldn't drink the water in Mexico. But now the cars are made in Mexico and you can't drink the water in Michigan. And thirdly, her antipathy to Russia, which she has mentioned more often than any other issue in the whole campaign. I forget how many times now, but it's hundreds and hundreds of times. Her determination to confront Russia in Syria, the danger of her taking America into yet another war. People have recoiled from all these things.
Yes, correct. I think all the opinion polls, and here I think opinion polls have been correct, the attitude surveys, from the time of George W. Bush, around 2005, 2006, when the Iraq War, or the occupation, went pear-shaped and it broke out into pretty much a full-scale civil war, and you got the sacking of Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense at that time, it's been a steady increase of the proportion of Americans who do not want the United States either to be unilateral or to put itself out there in front of everybody, effectively dominating the world, or without partners, without UN approval, and so on. And that, if you like, that tendency has been very powerful, and that has come through. It came through to some extent in the Sanders base, although less in his campaign, but it came through very strongly within Donald Trump's own campaign as well. And that has been ignored. But Hillary Clinton is a hardcore, mainstream supporter of the liberal international order in all its idealized versions from 1945 onwards. She believes in all the alliances and all the treaties and all the kind of general economic, financial and other arrangements, international arrangements which have been set up. She is the personification, she is the supporter of it, she believes it, she's an ideologue for it. But she was the only one who survived, if you like, within this contest between 17 Republicans who fought in the primaries and the various Democrats and so on and so forth. She was the only one who survived in the end, who supported the system as it is. Donald Trump doesn't come from within that system in that same way, and Bernie Sanders doesn't either. But they collectively got a very, very large number, 29 million primary votes. They got far more than anybody else. So what this was telling us is that actually the centre, so-called centre, which Hillary Clinton represents, has shrunk to a very, very small number. And that effectively there are people who are coming from outside the system who are saying this system no longer serves the American people in any way, shape or form.
Well, it was said of the Bourbons that they learned nothing and forgot nothing, and thus they were overthrown in the French Revolution. And that, it seems to be the case, may be happening in the United States this evening, is arguably happening elsewhere. And you rightly identify that it can break left and it can break right. And in the second half of the show, we'll have to tease that out a bit more, because on the face of it, Donald Trump is himself a plutocrat, born with several golden spoons in his mouth, fantastically rich, an unlikely Spartacus for the downtrodden and now unemployed workers in Michigan. And yet, the key point for the voters seems to have been that he was not one of them. He might be rich, but he's not rich and in the political class. He's not rich and got his pockets filled with Wall Street money. And of course, we've seen it break to the left here in Britain with Jeremy Corbyn's victory. We saw the strength of Bernie Sanders' campaign. In France, it's breaking to the right with the Front National and maybe other places too. It's a fascinating and even slightly dangerous prospect that lies ahead of us. But the centre cannot hold. There'll be much more where this came from after the break. Welcome back to a special US election night special edition of Sputnik. We're talking with Professor Inderjeet Parmar, a very considerable expert on American affairs and indeed politics in general. Professor, I'm getting news that the Mexican peso has gone through the floor at the possibility, maybe edging towards a probability, certainly a possibility of a Trump presidency. The Dow futures are down 300 when they were up yesterday, several hundred, on the prospects of a comparatively easy Clinton victory. If Trump is to be the president of the United States, what will the impact be on markets and on foreign capitals around the world?
That's a really good question, and it's likely to be very, very negative. The American economy is strong, but confidence in the American economy needs to be strong too, and it would look as if America's entering a period of increased instability as a result of, if Donald Trump wins the election. There's two things here. One is, if the House of Representatives remains in Republican hands.
Seems likely.
And the Senate remains in Republican hands too.
Also seems likely.
Then if those are true and Donald Trump wins, he has been rowing back on a number of his anti-conservative positions on taxation, for example, of the rich, and on welfare spending and so on as well, and has appointed the former president of the Heritage Foundation, Ed Fjellner, to his campaign transition team. He has also taken up the Heritage Foundation's blueprint for reform military policy, which is contradictory to his broader statements about what appeared to be America first or isolationist, as some people say, about drawing back a lot more and being sort of more selective about the kind of engagements that they would take place. If those are true, then what we could then see with a transactional president like Trump would be the ability to do deals with the Republican-held Congress.
I think
therefore,
you're absolutely right that, in fact, the likelihood is that Trump will make a sharp right turn if he enters the White House. But that will leave the voting base that just put him in seething with anger once they realize that, because the Heritage Foundation has nothing to offer the unemployed steel workers in Ohio.
Right, correct. So there will have to be something.
So this contest is between the devil and Beelzebub, isn't it?
I don't know who that is, but...
Beelzebub is another one. Okay, Satan and the devil.
Okay. Well, yeah, I'm not a religious person, so I don't know about good and evil so much, but it is a very, very difficult choice for American people, because in the end, this is a billionaire we're talking about, someone who has evaded taxes, or avoided taxes at the very least, hasn't paid very much tax over the years.
Hasn't paid for 18 years.
Believes it's a very smart thing to do.
He says that makes me smart. Yeah.
And he's also going to organise the biggest tax giveaway probably since George W. Bush before him, and probably deeply damaged the federal government's finances. I don't think there's very much that he's going to be able to offer in a big way to those industrial workers in Michigan and in Pennsylvania and in other places where they feel threatened by Hillary and by those free trade agreements that she called gold standard and so on. The fact is, though, however, that politics is politics, and in the end they're going to have to do something to have some kind of a concession to those workers. And he has suggested infrastructure spending, for example, in various ways, without too much detail.
An FDR in waiting that we just haven't
Not quite
seen
FDR,
yet.
not quite FDR, but certainly someone who can see that in order to solidify some kind of a base, you're going to have to do something practical.
Well, I'll tell you, you know how they like the third way over there. My wife's got a third way. She wants Obama to stay on. I mean, if Obama could just declare that he can't find his shoes.
And will it till the 29th of January, yeah?
Yeah, he can't find his shoes, he can't find his coat and hat, so he's just going to have to stay there. How do you see, as we now come to the end of it, how do you see President Obama's legacy?
I think there are many ways in which one can look at a legacy, and I think history will probably see Barack Obama as one of the very best presidents and probably a great president in time. He's leaving at with a very high level of approval.
So did Bill Clinton, of course.
Yeah, but I think when you look back at 2008, you have the Iraq War crisis. You have the meltdown of the financial system in the United States and having its global repercussions. He's probably inherited, I think in my view, a legacy which was a kind of combination of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1932, Lyndon Johnson around 1966 when the Vietnam War is going pear-shaped, and probably about 1976 with Jimmy Carter when there's been a defeat there. And the level of demoralization and the desire for change is so great within the American population. And its global standing is so low. So when you inherit all those crises and you come through with 2 terms, as the first African-American president too, with a massive kind of racialized campaign against him, run by who we may think may be the next president, then we see actually somebody who's got great sort of resilience and great power. And I think we'll probably be able to say at the end that he probably saved American capitalism by some of the bailouts that he organized and carried out and so on. Whether he solved the basic problem, I don't think he did. And I think that is part of why
tonight's election would seem to indicate that he didn't. I have a far less idealized version of the Obama years, but I'll grant you he certainly could have been much worse if the Republicans had defeated him. It would have been worse. I would rather look at it that he had a fantastic opportunity. America was sunk. The Wall Street was defunct, bankrupt. The country was mired in unpopular wars. He could have been the FDR. He could have really changed America. And as
And
we
he
look
was
at
not an imbecile like the one before
of course,
him.
he was a professor. I mean, the last guy had the alibi of being stupid, but President Obama is anything but stupid. Now, I mean, of course, compared, frankly, with Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, he's a more attractive figure. But I rather think his presidency will be seen as a kind of nothing 8 years, that nothing really went badly wrong, but nothing actually really changed for the better either. I mean, you mentioned race, Professor. Black people are being gunned down by police officers on the streets of the US at a rate that I've never seen in my lifetime.
Yeah, correct.
But at the same time, on the international platform, he did make the peace approaches.
Well, at least he avoided war with Iran, which a right-wing Republican might not have avoided. He avoided war with Russia, although the confrontation in Syria is now a very dangerous place, and he may have teed up a war, but he could have done better, that's all I'm saying. He was the first African American. He was elected with such a gale of idealistic support. He was so clever. I met him once, walked on a march with him, standing shoulder to shoulder, long before he was president, of course. And I was struck by how donnish, how professorial he was. Anyway, enough about Barack Obama. What about the future? What's the likely foreign policy implications of a Trump victory? Will his first meeting be with President Putin, do you think?
I don't know.
That would be a dramatic thing to do, you know?
Yeah, it would be dramatic. The foreign policy of Donald Trump, there is a general set of statements he's made about questioning the amount of sort of support foreign allies of America are giving in defending themselves. So in Japan and South Korea and so on, as well as in NATO. To some extent, he's just a more extreme version of most American presidents who've always said to the Europeans and to the Japanese and to the South Koreans, you've got to pull your weight a bit more. There's too much pressure on the United States. We're giving up too much of our resources. We, after all, have all these thousands of troops to defend you. You've got to carry a bigger share of the burden. He's just said it out loud and he's questioned it much more. Whether he would actually do anything very much in practice is the big question. What would he actually be able to do in terms of changing the relationship with NATO and America's role within it, and same in the case of Saudi Arabia in the Middle East, or in South Korea or Japan? That's the difficulty, because the intelligence community, the national security communities, the military community overall, those people in the upper echelons of those have, generally speaking, rejected the overall approach that Trump has been talking about. So whether he would be able to get enough people of caliber and experience and so on to serve under him would be a really interesting question.
Enough experts. The Persian Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia et al., have been throwing millions, perhaps vainly, into the Clinton coffers over these last years. They've lost out big time. I don't think Donald Trump has much time for the potentates of the Persian Gulf area. Do you think there might be a change of emphasis vis-à-vis the Arab world with Trump as president?
It's difficult to say, because his attitude towards Israel hasn't been particularly critical. In fact, he's gone out of his way to court Israel.
He started off not very critical, but he did make a stand in the beginning.
Yeah, many candidates for the presidency start off critical of Israel at the beginning of their campaign, just like Barack Obama did, and they end up somewhere else by the end of it. Israel is the sort of strongest armed power in the Middle East.
No, he's not going to turn his back on Israel, but he might, just watch this space, turn his back, take a very different stance towards Saudi Arabia and that other cluster of satrapies around it. The Yemen war, for example, he might take a very, very different point of view? Well, we don't know the outcome. Of course, it could be President Clinton II. We'll have to wait until later in the morning, but it's looking increasingly like President Donald Trump. Professor, I sincerely mean it. Alas, we're out of time. That's all we've got time for.
But you can stay in touch with us on social media, on Twitter, RT_Sputnik, on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been presidential.